Samantha Johnson let out a deep sigh and snapped shut the hefty book on government contract law that was sprawled across her desk. It was time to call it a day. She sat in her small office at the university, where she taught law, but this book was for some side work she did for a law firm on occasion. If she left now, she'd make it in time for her usual train ride home. Her husband, Mike, had left for a business trip earlier that morning, but unlike the early years of their marriage, she didn't feel anxious about it. In fact, she found the idea of spending 2 weeks on her own to be refreshing. She was eager to get home. Samantha and Mike had met back in college. He was a couple of years older, already close to finishing his business degree, while she was still halfway through her studies, uncertain of her career path. She smiled, thinking back to that night they first crossed paths at a rowdy fraternity party. If only things could stay as perfect as they were back then, she mused with a hint of sadness, her smile fading as she flipped off the office light and locked the door behind her. They'd been together for 18 years, almost half of her life, she realized with a bit of surprise. As much as she loved Mike, she couldn't ignore how their marriage had lost its spark in recent years. They'd been married for 15 of those years, and in the beginning, Mike had been her biggest cheerleader when she was pursuing her law degree. But recently, the dynamic had shifted. She was now out-earning him, especially after his company ran into financial trouble last year. To make ends meet, she had taken on extra work from a law firm she used to collaborate with. Mike, always the perfectionist, found it difficult to acknowledge his struggles, and that pride had become the root of their marital issues. His increasing dependence on her was just a constant reminder of the things he couldn't quite fix. There were so many things Samantha cherished about him, but his stubbornness wasn't one of them. As she strolled across the campus, heading towards the train station, the crisp autumn air hinted that mid-October had settled in. She was comfortable enough in her light sweater, blouse, and knee-length skirt, but it wouldn't be long before she'd need to start wearing a coat. She picked up her pace when she saw her train approaching, knowing it wouldn't wait long, and managed to slide into an empty seat, a little winded from the brief sprint. Almost immediately, she noticed the man sitting directly across from her. He was studying her, taking in her appearance. Samantha was in her late 30s, her dark hair falling just past her shoulders, her skin still carrying a faint summer tan. The cool evening air had flushed her cheeks a soft pink, something she knew men often found appealing. At 5 feet 6 inches and with an athletic frame, kept lean by her regular running routine, she was confident in her looks, though she knew she was more pretty than beautiful. Mike, on the other hand, had always preferred women with more curves, but he had still fallen in love with her, and she never hesitated to remind him of that whenever he jokingly hinted at her getting implants. The man across from her, with short dark hair just starting to go gray at the sides and a mustache that had a certain Tom Selleck vibe, was clearly taken with her. He wasn't one of her regular train companions, the silent, nameless faces she recognized from her commute. Sitting in front of her today was a girl she mentally nicknamed Red, a short, pierced-up woman with a star tattoo on the back of her head and, unsurprisingly, fiery red hair. It had been green last week, but Samantha still thought of her as Red. Behind Magnum, as she decided to call the man with the mustache, sat Big Beard, an older, balding guy with a wild, untamed beard. He wore a wedding ring, and Samantha often wondered how his wife put up with him looking like that. There were plenty of familiar faces, but Magnum was new. As Samantha turned her blue eyes toward him, she felt herself blush under his bold gaze, her dimples appearing as she smiled nervously. He had a wedding ring, too, but that didn't seem to stop him from checking her out like he was already forgetting about his wife for the night. Samantha tried to focus on her book but kept glancing up, feeling flustered under his relentless stare. She wasn't scared, the train was crowded enough, but she kept looking for an empty seat, planning to move the first chance she got. As the train made its usual stops, she mentally said goodbye to the familiar passengers, knowing their routines as well as her own by now. The moment a seat opened up, she shifted to it, but she could still feel Magnum's eyes following her. The closer the train got to her stop, the more she found herself silently praying that Magnum would get off soon. Relief washed over her when he finally stood up and exited a few stops before hers. Even then, as he stood on the platform, he threw one last lingering look at her until the train pulled away. When she got off at her stop, she hurried toward the bus that would take her home. She owned a car but rarely drove it to work. City traffic and parking were a hassle she didn't need. Even though Magnum was long gone, the thought of his gaze left her feeling unsettled. It wasn't that she feared him or sensed danger, but something about him made her nervous. He shared more than just a mustache with Tom Selleck. He had those rugged good looks and broad shoulders that always caught her attention. The problem was, she found him attractive, and that's what worried her. His eyes had made it pretty clear that he'd be more than willing to act on that attraction if she gave him half a chance. It was clear to me that he was interested in more than just sharing the view of the train. Despite the rough patch Mike and I had been going through in our marriage, I never seriously considered cheating. But then again, I figured most people don't plan on it, it just sneaks up on them. Either way, nothing was going to happen between me and this Magnum, no matter how warm his handsome face made me feel in that moment, especially with the chill in the air. When I finally stepped inside my house, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing a sigh of relief. Safe and sound. I hoped Mike would give me a call tonight, though he hadn't been calling as often on his trips as he used to. Still, Magnum's face kept popping into my head, as if I had seen him before. While heading to the kitchen to pour myself a drink, I grabbed Mike's good scotch and filled the glass, tossing it back in one quick gulp. He didn't actually resemble Magnum that much, I thought, besides the mustache. But there was something about his face, something familiar, something just as striking. Maybe I had seen him on the train before, or maybe not. Either way, he was gone now, and I probably wouldn't see him again. Nothing to worry about, I told myself. Yet a small part of me felt unsettled, wondering if I'd ever run into him again. That strange feeling led me to pour another drink as I tried, and failed, to focus on making dinner. As I chopped vegetables for a simple stir-fry, my mind kept drifting back to Magnum. I couldn't shake his intense gaze, and it was frustrating. I knew I had a good figure and an attractive face, but it was easy to forget that when Mike had shown so little interest in intimacy lately. I started to wonder who this guy was and why he'd been so openly drawn to me. I didn't think I was the kind of woman who would cheat, but feeling that spark of interest from another man was unexpected, and stirred something inside me. It hit me then, I couldn't even remember the last time Mike had looked at me with that kind of desire. When I finished cooking, I took my plate into the living room and ate while flipping through the TV channels, hoping to distract myself. But no matter what I turned on, I couldn't escape reminders of Magnum. From the local news anchor with his own mustache to the game show host I used to watch, there were traces of him everywhere. It didn't help that every time I switched to a different channel, something seemed to bring him back into my thoughts. Finally, I gave up and turned off the TV in frustration. I cleaned up the dishes and headed upstairs to my office. Mike and I had bought this big 4-bedroom house right after we got married, thinking we'd fill it with kids. As I passed by what should have been a child's bedroom, a wave of sadness hit me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I was in law school, I always thought I'd be having kids around that time. But instead, I ended up becoming a lawyer and working full-time before I had to face the truth that something was wrong. Mike had been supportive at first, claiming he'd do anything to help, but everything changed when the doctor told us the issue wasn't with me, it was with him. From that point on, he refused to talk about it. He wouldn't accept the diagnosis and started saying we didn't need children anyway. I loved Mike enough to let it go, to not push him, but as his interest in me faded and he spent more and more time away on business trips trying to save his failing company, the emptiness of our home weighed on me. Every single day, I wished the problem had been with me, so at least we could have tried something, anything. People, of course, always had something to say. Samantha, you're so lucky you don't have kids to worry about when you travel, or, wow, you've still got such a great figure, I wish I could say the same after having kids. Oh yeah, lucky me. People can be so clueless. I knew they didn't mean any harm, but if they understood how much those words hurt, they'd probably never say them again. I sat down at my desk and logged into the university's server to grab some files I'd need for tomorrow. The next few weeks were going to be packed, and if one of these cases didn't settle, I'd end up spending several days in court on top of my regular workload. But with an empty house around me and thoughts of a stranger's attention still swimming in my mind, concentrating on work felt impossible. Suddenly, I realized something: it wasn't too late for me to have kids. That thought took me by surprise. I shook my head, trying to push it away. I loved Mike more than anything, even with all his stubborn pride that had cost us so much. But that night, my thoughts took me somewhere dangerous. With a full glass of wine in hand, I went back to my home office and closed the files I had opened. There was no point in pretending to work when my heart wasn't in it. As I checked my email, I saw a message from my sister. She was inviting me over for dinner this weekend, and I thought maybe that was exactly what I needed to take my mind off things. Samantha smiled as she thought about her niece and nephew, already looking forward to spoiling them again. Whenever she felt down about not having kids of her own, her sister's children always ended up with some unexpected gift from their favorite aunt. But the thought of Magnum kept creeping back into her mind. Where had she seen him before? The more she dwelled on it, the more convinced she became that she had encountered him somewhere else, and it wasn't just on the train. Curious, she pulled up her browser history, searching for the website she had visited a few days ago. After diving into the site for a while, she was finally able to push the thought of him out of her head. When she finished, she shut down her computer, turned off the lights, and decided to call it a night. Filling the bathtub, she caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror as she undressed. Her friends weren't wrong, she really did look almost the same as she had 20 years ago. But at that moment, she would have given anything for a stretch mark or a scar from a C-section, anything that showed she had carried a child. Submerged in the warm water, Samantha dipped her head below the surface for a moment, emerging to push her wet hair behind her ears. In the beginning, Mike couldn't get enough of her, giving her all the attention she wanted. But lately, that attention had shifted. And now, thoughts of Magnum lingered in her mind, uninvited. Later, as she dried herself off, she felt colder than when she had first stepped into the bath, almost dirtier, despite having just cleaned up. Maybe Mike would call tonight. It would be nice to hear his voice, but she didn't hold out much hope. It was the first night apart on this trip, and she was certain he was enjoying the space just as much as she was. Calling him at the hotel didn't feel right. She hated disturbing him unless it was really important, and if he wasn't there, he'd call her back when he got the message, no matter the hour. As she brushed her teeth, she avoided looking at her reflection in the mirror, not wanting to confront the guilty look on her face. Deciding to skip drying her hair, she figured she'd take care of it in the morning with a shower. She tossed the towel at the foot of the bed and slipped under the covers, but sleep wouldn't come. The bed, which she usually shared with Mike, felt emptier than ever. Glancing at the clock with frustration, she watched the minutes tick by: 11:17, 11:44, 12:20, 12:52. Finally, sometime after 1:30, she drifted off. The next morning, she was relieved not to run into Magnum on her way to work. Her morning class kept her busy enough to keep thoughts of him at bay, and that day was packed with visits to 2 law firms. She even asked her department secretary to squeeze in a third appointment that had come up at the last minute. While eating lunch alone in her office, she checked one of her credit cards online and noticed something that required her to call the bank. "Hello, this is Samantha Johnson. I need a fax of our purchases on this card for the last 2 years. Can you help with that?" "Great, thanks. I can confirm any account details you need," she replied to the employee's questions. "I'm trying to remember when and where we bought this laptop that isn't working. I lost the receipt, but I believe the store signed us up for an extended warranty, and I'd like to see if it's still valid before I go replacing it." "Thanks, I really appreciate it." A few minutes later, her secretary Janice walked in with the fax. "Here you go, Samantha," Janice said, handing her the printout. "I also managed to schedule that last appointment for you at 4 o'clock. "Thanks, Janice," Samantha replied, scanning through the papers with a satisfied smile. "This is exactly what I needed." That afternoon, she powered through her first 2 appointments, making sure she had enough time for the last one, which had come up unexpectedly. With only a couple of weeks left to prepare, her most important client was counting on her to get everything in order. Heading to the final meeting of the day, her bag packed with documents that needed reviewing, she was greeted by the company's secretary and shown into the office. "Samantha. Good to see you again," Charlie Dunn said, standing up to welcome her. Charlie was an old friend and colleague. Her first job after law school had been at his firm, and from day one, he'd always looked out for her. She remembered how nervous she had been when they first met, but Charlie had made a joke about their names being so similar, instantly putting her at ease. "So, you've got something important to run by me?" Charlie asked, gesturing for her to sit. "I hope it's nothing too serious." "Nothing major, I don't think," Samantha replied, taking a folder out of her bag. "But you're the expert on this kind of thing, so I was hoping you could give it a look." "Sure thing," Charlie said, taking the folder and glancing into her eyes before flipping it open. He nodded as he skimmed through the documents, raising his head a few times and shaking it thoughtfully, as if weighing the legal significance of what he was reading. "I guess you're trying to make sure this stands up in court?" he asked. "Exactly," she said with a slight, nervous smile. "Well, from what I can tell, this looks solid." "Reinforced concrete, really," he assured her with a nod. "Even with the recent changes in circumstances?" No provisions have been made for that," Samantha confirmed. "Well, the agreement is clear and precise," Charlie said, his tone reassuring. "I don't think you've got anything to worry about." "I'm sure you'll win this case with your eyes closed," Charlie said with a grin. "But you know I'm always here if you need any extra help." "Thank you, Charlie," Samantha replied, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "Hopefully, I can bring you on board to assist me with this." "Anytime," he said, smiling warmly. "Barb and I are watching the grandkids for the rest of the week, but if you want to swing by tonight, we could probably hammer out a good deal in just a few hours." "You're the best," she said, standing up to give him a hug. "There's a lot more to dig into here, believe me, but I need to do some more research first. I think I'll have everything figured out by Thursday night." "That works. How about 8 o'clock? The kids should be in bed by then, and we'll have plenty of time to go over everything," Charlie said. "Sounds perfect." "See you then," Samantha replied, tucking the folder back into her bag. She left the office feeling more confident than ever. She had faith in her abilities before meeting with Charlie, but now she was even more certain that they'd win this case. Sure, he was a friend, but she knew Charlie would always give her an honest, unbiased opinion. There was still some work to be done, and she planned to consult a few more experts, but it was unlikely they'd find anything that Charlie hadn't already spotted. Like any good lawyer, Samantha prided herself on being thoroughly prepared, and she wasn't going to leave room for any surprises in a case this important. It wasn't until she boarded her usual train home that she found herself thinking about Magnum again. Her positive meeting with Charlie had put her in such a good mood that Magnum didn't have the same impact on her as the day before. She smiled sweetly at him, tucking her hair behind her ear, and sat a few rows ahead, blushing to herself. There was no harm in indulging a harmless fantasy, she thought, especially considering what her mind had conjured up the night before. Though the idea of acting on anything was still off the table, it felt less foreign than it had just 24 hours ago. Looking back briefly, she noticed Magnum got off at the same stop as yesterday. Once she arrived home, Samantha locked the door behind her and glanced around the empty house, the familiar loneliness settling in as tears welled up in her eyes. After a quiet dinner, she sat in the living room, flipping through interior design magazines. Decorating had always been a hobby of hers, a way to pass the time. Their home was always tidy, devoid of the clutter of kids' toys, and while it drew compliments from visitors, what she wouldn't give to have a box of toys spilling out in the corner, something that seemed so out of reach. She decided she'd redecorate a few rooms when Mike got back. But as she tried to focus on color schemes and patterns, the sadness crept in, and she found herself crying again. Closing the magazines, she went to bed early. Tomorrow was another early start. She had to get up before 6 to squeeze in a run before work. Closing her eyes, she saw Magnum's face again, and this time, she didn't fight it. She drifted into a deep sleep, letting her mind wander into forbidden places. The next morning, she woke at dawn, quickly dressed in her workout gear, grabbed a bottle of water, and headed out the door. Her usual running route cleared her mind, the cool autumn air crisp against her skin. It was just her, the sidewalk, and the steady rhythm of her feet pounding the pavement. No sad thoughts, no tempting strangers. By the time she finished her run, she was sweating despite the chill in the air. She added a quick smaller lap before heading back to shower and prepare for another busy day. Her schedule was packed, with classes in the morning and several law firm visits in the afternoon. There was still a lot of work to do, including an evening meeting to wrap up details on a big deal. So far, neither firm had found any issues that Charlie hadn't already considered, and the good news helped her relax a bit. Taking the late train home after her evening meeting, Samantha yawned, her mind already focused on her bed. That's when she felt it, the familiar gaze. She didn't even need to turn her head to know it was him. Magnum was there again, watching her just like before. At first, she had wondered where he had come from so suddenly, but now he seemed to show up regularly, even when her schedule changed. As long as they were in a crowded public space, Samantha didn't feel too worried, though she didn't return his stare or smile this time. There was no point in encouraging him any further. Relief washed over her when he got off at his usual stop. Even so, she found herself glancing over her shoulder nervously for the rest of the ride home. That night, Samantha made a decision: she would drive to work the next day. Despite the traffic, it would make things easier for her to get to Charlie's house for their evening meeting without going home first. The early start and long day had left her exhausted. After a quick dinner, she fell into bed, but thoughts of Magnum invaded her mind once again. It wasn't that she feared he would harm her, it was the fear of where things could lead if she didn't rein in her growing attraction. Could she hold out until Mike returned? Or would she eventually give in to the silent temptation? For the third night in a row, she dreamed of him. No matter how many times she tried to banish him from her thoughts, Magnum returned as the star of her fantasies. The next morning, Samantha drove to work, relieved to avoid her quiet admirer on the train. His continuous staring, though silent, left no doubt about his intentions. She was certain the other passengers had noticed too. If he had approached her that first day, she would have rejected him without hesitation. But now, he was slowly wearing down her resistance, fantasy by fantasy. It didn't help that she still hadn't heard from Mike. Everywhere she turned, there were reminders of the cracks in their marriage. All she needed was to hear his voice, for him to say he loved her, and Magnum wouldn't stand a chance. What kind of husband goes away for almost a week and doesn't call his wife, she thought angrily. Her morning classes passed by in a blur, and she spent lunch alone in her office, still stewing in her thoughts. Samantha shut the door behind her and let the tears fall, crying until she had no more left. Once she'd poured out all her emotions, she gathered herself together. There was still work to be done, and she had an important meeting to attend. As she walked to her car, ready for the afternoon's activities, a shiver ran down her spine. She knew he was watching her again. Determined, she scanned her surroundings, daring him to show himself. But there was no sign of him as she quickly got into her car and sped away, silently praying he wouldn't be able to follow. Though she hadn't seen him in the parking lot, the thought that he was lurking nearby made her uneasy. After her last meeting, Samantha called Charlie, her voice trembling with the fear she had been holding in all week. She told him everything that had happened, and he could hear the fear she was trying to mask. "Come on over, sweetheart," Barb said warmly when she opened the door, wrapping Samantha in a comforting hug. "You're safe here. That man can't hurt you now." Charlie stood nearby, his face etched with concern as he listened to Barb's reassuring words. For a moment, Samantha felt like she was with family again, even though her own parents lived far away in Florida. With these old friends, she had the support she desperately needed. "I brought a file for us to discuss," Samantha said finally, gathering herself. "Leave it to me. I'll take care of it tomorrow," Charlie offered with a nod, his understanding expression making her feel lighter already. "I fed the grandkids earlier, but our dinner's still in the works." "You're staying for dinner with us," Barb stated, not even giving Samantha a chance to refuse, though she would have accepted the offer regardless. During dinner, Samantha opened up more, finding comfort in the warmth of her friends and their wise words. Both Charlie and Barb offered their help in any way they could, but Samantha assured them she'd manage. Tonight, she needed to lean on their strength, but she knew she'd be okay on her own tomorrow. After a few laughs and more than a few tears, she stood up to leave, feeling grateful beyond words for their kindness. "You should stay with us tonight," Barb suggested as Samantha began gathering her things. "Oh, no. I can't impose on you," Samantha said, guilt creeping in at the thought of being a burden. "Nonsense," Barb replied, shaking her head. "We don't have any spare beds with the grandkids here, but you can share the bed with me, and Charlie will take the couch for the night." "It's no problem." Charlie chimed in, "Really, it's no trouble at all. We'd be happy to have you stay." Samantha smiled, deeply touched by their offer. "You two are incredible, but I'll be fine at home." "I don't like this," Barb said, glancing at Charlie, waiting for him to step in. "If we can't convince you to stay," Charlie said, "then at least let me drive you home or follow you back. I don't feel right about you being alone." "You've already done more than enough for me tonight," Samantha replied, shaking her head gently. "But thank you. I'll be fine." "Well, at least promise to call us when you get home so we know you're safe," Charlie said, his concern evident. "I promise," she said, smiling as she hugged them both goodbye. Though Samantha acted bravely in front of her friends, the drive home filled her with dread. Alone with her thoughts, she struggled to keep it together. The urge to pull over and cry nearly overtook her. She knew Mike wasn't going to call, and she knew that Magnum would likely find her again tomorrow. Each day, the part of her heart that wasn't so sure of what she'd do grew a little bigger. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she sat in the car for a long time, scanning her surroundings before making a dash for the door. Her hands fumbled with the keys as tears welled up again. Once inside, she locked the door behind her and immediately set the alarm. Leaning against the door, she took a few shaky breaths before calling Charlie, her voice steadying as they spoke. After hanging up, she ran herself a bath. As the warm water filled the tub, she caught her reflection in the mirror, tears slipping down her cheeks once again. She let herself cry until there were no more tears. The next morning, Samantha decided to leave the car at home, even though it meant she'd likely encounter Magnum again. But after a night of reflection, she realized she wasn't afraid of him anymore. No look from him could force her into something she didn't want to do. Her day unfolded like any other, morning classes followed by meetings with law firms in the afternoon. She wrapped up her work early that Friday and caught her usual train home. Where is he? She wondered, scanning the carriage for Magnum. Despite her readiness to confront him, he was nowhere to be seen. A part of her was relieved. It was dangerous to keep crossing paths with him. She knew exactly what she wanted to say to him, but maybe it was better this way. For the first time all week, she could sit on the train and read a book in peace. When she got off at her stop, she headed to the bus stop and checked her watch. The bus would be arriving any minute, and she glanced around at the other passengers, relieved that he wasn't among them. Once she boarded the bus, she felt a wave of calm wash over her. The short ride passed quickly, and she got off, waiting for the bus to pull away before crossing the street. But just as she stepped onto the road, she froze. There he was, Magnum, standing on the other side, watching her with that same familiar gaze. Her heart raced as she locked eyes with him. The word Samantha wanted to say vanished from her mind as fear took hold. She instinctively stepped back, her heart pounding, and started walking down her street. Glancing over her shoulder with a desperate hope that maybe he wouldn't follow, her fears were confirmed. There he was, walking parallel to her, his eyes fixed on her. She cursed herself for wearing heels, they'd do nothing to help her if she needed to run. As they neared her house, panic set in. She was on the wrong side of the road, and Magnum, no, John, she reminded herself, was still trailing her. What should she do? Head to the gas station at the corner? Knock on a neighbor's door? Her mind raced as her house came into view, but John had stopped several houses before hers. He knew where she lived. There was no doubt in her mind now, either he would leave her a safe exit, or he was setting her up for something much worse. Her throat went dry, her stomach in knots, as she pulled her keys out of her purse. With shaking hands, she bolted toward her front door. John followed at a safe distance, and when she fumbled with her keys in nervous excitement, they slipped from her grip and fell to the ground. Spinning around, she saw him just a few steps away. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to steady her voice. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender and stepping back slightly. "I asked, who are you?" she repeated, her voice growing louder, more desperate. "John." "John Smith," he replied, but Samantha didn't buy it. "Sure," she snorted, "and I'm Jane Doe." "What do you want?" she asked, her back pressed firmly against the door. Reaching into his jacket, he said, "It's just my wallet." "See?" He tossed it at her feet. "You can check for yourself," he added gently. Keeping her eyes on him, Samantha crouched down, grabbing the keys along with his wallet. She quickly opened it, pulling out a Maryland driver's license. There he was, John W. Smith, staring back at her with that same piercing gaze. "Well, John Smith," she said coldly, "what do you want?" He smirked, the kind of smile she had seen too many times this week. "I think you know," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I'm married," she shot back, raising her hand to show him her wedding ring. "So am I," he replied, holding up his own ring. "But tell me, is your marriage everything you thought it would be?" His tone turned bitter. "I don't want anything to do with you," Samantha said firmly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her resolve. John stepped closer, his eyes searching hers for hesitation. "Are you sure about that?" he asked quietly. She knew he was waiting for her to say, "Stop." But the words never came. He moved closer, and before she knew it, he was standing inches from her, his hand gently tilting her chin upward. She didn't pull away. Her fear melted as he leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers. He wasn't forcing anything, he was waiting for her to give in. And she did. They kissed. It was wrong in every way, but at that moment, it didn't matter. They shouldn't have done it here, not where the neighbors could see, but it was too late. Samantha turned her back to him and opened the door, stepping inside on shaky legs. She didn't have to invite him in, he followed, knowing exactly what was going to happen next. They made love, and afterward, as the reality of what she had done washed over her, she felt exposed and ashamed. She had always believed she was stronger than this, but now she wondered what had become of the woman she used to be. After everything that had just happened, she only hoped it wouldn't be too difficult to get him to leave. "I knew from the first moment I saw you that you'd be incredible," John said, smirking at her as he buttoned his shirt. "What happened here shouldn't have," Samantha replied, trying to steady her voice, though she could barely look at him. "But it did," he said, unbothered. "It's time for you to go," she said quietly, turning her back to him. At least tell me your name, he asked, and without thinking, she replied, Samantha. The moment the name left her lips, she regretted it. She had already shared too much with this man. Samantha, he repeated, savoring the sound of it. Beautiful name. He glanced down at his wedding ring and sighed. You're right. I should go, he said, but his question lingered in the air. Is this really what you want? It wasn't. Part of her wanted him to stay, just like in the fantasies she had indulged in all week. But she couldn't bring herself to ask. Instead, she remained silent, letting him make the decision. Pulling out a bottle of Mike's favorite scotch from the cabinet, Samantha poured them both a glass. It felt strange sharing her husband's drink with another man, but considering what else they had shared tonight, it didn't seem like such a big deal. John accepted the glass with a smile, clinking it with hers. There was no toast, nothing to celebrate in that moment. They both knew it. After draining his glass, he held it out for a refill, but Samantha stopped after one. She didn't want him drunk, especially since she barely knew him. As she watched him closely, she couldn't help but admire his rugged features. His strong jaw, that thick mustache, and his broad shoulders all oozed masculinity. He was taller and more physically imposing than Mike, with a flat stomach that hinted at his fitness. It wasn't hard to see why she had been drawn to him, but the shame of what she had done lingered just beneath the surface. Leaving her work papers and bag on the kitchen table, Samantha led him toward the stairs. She didn't need to ask what he wanted to do, there was only one answer. But instead of leading him to her own bedroom, she took him to the guest room. It was as far as she could go that night. Her own bed was sacred, meant for her husband, and she couldn't bring herself to cross that line. The sterile, unused look of the guest room must have told him it wasn't her space, but John didn't care. What mattered to him was what they'd shared, and Samantha felt a deep sense of gratitude toward him, though she didn't know why. She couldn't find the words to express what was swirling inside her. John pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offering her one. She shook her head, leaning in for one last kiss before slipping out of the room. Naked, she hurried back to her bedroom, grabbing a robe before returning to the guest room. But when she got back, John was already gone. Looking out the window, she saw him walking down the street, disappearing into the night. She locked the door behind him. Samantha sank to the floor, feeling cold from the inside out. The tears she'd been holding back all night finally broke through, spilling down her face uncontrollably. She cried until there were no more tears left. Exhausted and drained, she collected herself as best she could, knowing she had to push through the day. But the weight of what had happened clung to her like a shadow. That night, her sleep was shattered by nightmares. In one, David found her in bed with John, his face twisted in shock and betrayal. In another, he had a gun. She woke up the next morning, feeling dirty and ashamed. How had she let this happen? She was better than this. She couldn't undo what had been done, but the guilt was suffocating. Normally, she didn't shower before her morning run, but today was different. Her skin felt like it was crawling, and she scrubbed herself under scalding hot water, though it did nothing to cleanse her soul. Carrie had always loved her morning runs, they were her way of clearing her mind, no matter what life threw at her. But today, no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't shake thoughts of John. When she returned home, she locked the door behind her and paused. She wanted him again, but the shame still hung heavy, and she wasn't ready to face it. In the quiet of her master bathroom, she filled the tub, preparing for a long, hot soak. Sliding into the warm water, almost up to her neck, she let the heat soothe her. Every time the water began to cool, she added more hot water, wanting to stay there all day, as if it could somehow melt away her confusion. Sinking beneath the surface, she held her breath until her lungs burned and her head spun. When she finally emerged, gasping for air, she felt a little more ready to face the rest of her life, whatever it had in store. Once she was dry and dressed, Samantha decided she needed a distraction. She called her sister Cindy, telling her she'd be arriving early for dinner. Before heading to her sister's, she made a stop at a toy store to buy gifts for her niece and nephew. Normally, trips to the toy store left her feeling hollow, a reminder of the children she never had, but today felt different. Despite what had happened with John, or maybe because of it, she allowed herself to think about the possibility of children again. Even though she wasn't in a fertile time of the month, just the idea of him set her imagination running wild. With the gifts in tow, she made the hour-long drive to her sister's house, arriving hours before dinner. Cindy greeted her at the door with a warm hug but could immediately sense that something was off. The kids came running, excited to see their Aunt Samantha, showering her with hugs and kisses before rushing off to play with their new toys. Cindy and her husband Steve invited her inside, and although they could tell something was weighing on her, they didn't press. They knew her well enough to wait until the kids were out of earshot. They sat together in the living room, sipping wine and chatting about nothing in particular, while Cindy and Steve worked in the kitchen to finish preparing dinner. Afterward, they all gathered to play a board game with the kids until it was time for bed. When Steve took the children upstairs, Samantha's heart swelled as they thanked her once again for the toys. But when she turned back to see Cindy's serious face, she knew her sister wasn't going to let her off the hook. "All right, what's really going on, sis?" Cindy asked, once the kids were tucked in. "Something's been bothering you all day." Samantha hesitated, but she knew she couldn't hide anything from her sister. "Nothing," she began, but she knew Cindy wasn't buying it. "You may be older than me, but I'm not so easy to fool anymore," Cindy said with a smile. "Come on, spill. Or should I call Mom?" Taking a deep breath, Samantha finally opened up. She told Cindy everything that had happened over the past week, all the emotions, the confusion, and the shame. By the end, her sister was holding her, both of them crying together. When Steve came back downstairs, Cindy briefly filled him in. His reaction was swift and fierce. He was angry, ready to track down John and teach him a lesson for hurting Samantha, who was like a big sister to him. But she made him promise not to do anything rash, explaining that it was her fault too. As guilty as she felt, it was a comfort knowing she had their full support. Why couldn't her marriage be more like Cindy and Steve's? She thought with a pang of envy. David used to hold her the way Steve held Cindy, but those days felt so far away now. Later, after the tears had dried, they all sat around with cups of coffee, reminiscing about old times. Samantha smiled as they laughed about when Cindy and Steve were still high school sweethearts, sneaking around with her and David. They remembered the time their dad had nearly caught them all during a surprise visit. He never approved of Samantha and David living together before marriage. But now, even the fun memories were bittersweet. David hadn't come with her on this visit, and the last time they'd had dinner with Cindy and Steve, he barely said 2 words to Steve. Samantha suspected he was jealous that Steve had given Cindy 2 beautiful children while he and Samantha were still childless. But David never talked about it. It was past 10 when Samantha slipped on her coat to head home. Cindy tried to convince her to stay the night, but she refused. She assured them she'd be fine and invited them over for dinner next Saturday. The drive home gave her time to think. There was so much to do in the coming week, but no matter how full her schedule was, thoughts of John continued to creep in. He was probably gone by now, she reasoned. He was from out of state, just here on business. For all she knew, he could already be on his way out of her life. The idea that he could disappear so quickly left her with an unexpected feeling of sadness. As she pulled into her driveway and parked the car, the weight of it all settled on her once again. Samantha realized with a jolt that she had forgotten to leave the light on before leaving. The evening chill was sharp, hinting at the first frost of the season. As she got out of the car and buttoned her coat, she braced herself against the darkness. Fumbling with her keys at the door, a voice came from the shadows. "I was about to leave," John said, startling her. She jumped, her heart racing. "Oh, thank God," it's just you, she said with a shaky breath of relief. You scared me half to death. You shouldn't have come here again. You didn't want to see me, he asked, his tone almost teasing. She hesitated. I do, but we can't be seen like this. It's too risky. No one sees anything out here, he said softly, stepping closer, his hand brushing her cheek as the moonlight caught his face. You know what I mean, she replied, smiling in the dark despite herself. I'll leave, if that's what you want, he offered. She looked into his eyes and made a decision she couldn't take back. You can stay tonight, she said, unlocking the door, but next time, we meet at your hotel. She wasn't pretending anymore, not to herself and certainly not to him. The truth was clear, there was no point in hiding her intentions. Once inside, she noticed for the first time that he had brought her flowers. She accepted them with a soft, sad smile, lowering her head as he leaned in for a kiss. They made love again, but this time, it felt heavier. She knew it wasn't a one-time mistake anymore. Samantha wanted nothing more than to fall asleep and escape into dreams where her life wasn't such a mess, but she forced herself to stay awake until she was sure he had left. She needed to lock the door behind him before she could sleep. Naked, she walked downstairs and found a note near the door. John had left his hotel address and room number. She picked it up and smiled, then carried it upstairs with her. It was late, and she was too exhausted to shower or bathe, so she crashed in the guest room, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. When she woke up early in the strange bed, the shame from the night before weighed heavily on her. She took a quick shower before heading out for her morning run, even though she knew she'd just get sweaty again. She needed to feel clean, even though the shower couldn't wash away the dirt that lingered in her soul. As the warm water streamed over her, she let out a few invisible tears, hoping they would disappear down the drain along with her guilt. She stared at the crumpled piece of paper with John's hotel information. Part of her wanted to throw it away, but deep down, she knew she wasn't done with him. As much as she felt disgusted by what she had done, she knew she would see him again. During her usual jog, the steady rhythm of her footsteps against the pavement helped clear her mind, if only for a little while. She focused on her breathing, on the exertion of running, anything to push John out of her thoughts. Work loomed ahead, with meetings and appointments packed into her schedule, and she let herself believe that would be enough to distract her. But then, as she ran, the word cheating struck her like a blow. It had never crossed her mind in that exact way before. One time could have been a mistake, but twice, with no end in sight, was an affair. The realization hit hard, this could destroy her marriage. Back at home, Samantha didn't rush into the shower. Instead, she headed to the kitchen, disgusted by how messy everything was. After breakfast, she kept her tracksuit on and got to work cleaning the house. She scrubbed the kitchen, vacuumed the floors, and finally went upstairs to strip the sheets from the guest bed, carrying them down to the washer. Cleaning felt like the only thing she could control right now. Once the laundry was done, she put fresh sheets back on the guest bed and tidied up, making sure everything was in its place. Exhausted but satisfied, she finally treated herself to the long, hot bath she had been looking forward to. As she sank into the water, her mind wandered back to her life with David. Where had it all gone wrong? Could she have avoided any of it? The memories of the good times they had shared together overwhelmed her with sadness. Tears flowed freely as she hugged herself, sinking deeper into the water, trying to hold off the emptiness that had taken root in her heart. Samantha didn't know what the future held, but she was certain of one thing: she wasn't done with John. She would visit him again, despite the shame she carried. After her bath, she wrapped herself in a soft towel and went to her bedroom. As she rummaged through her closet, looking for something to wear, the towel slipped from her body, and she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Turning and twisting, she wondered what could have pushed David away. She had always been observant, it had served her well in her legal career, and she knew that men, including John, had always found her athletic figure attractive. Running her fingers over a small birthmark on her skin, she remembered David once telling her he found it charming. Her body wasn't the problem, and she knew it. David had once loved her deeply, and she had never doubted his attraction to her. So, where had it all gone wrong? That question haunted her, even as she tried to push it away, knowing that the answers might not matter anymore. Samantha often relied on makeup to make her lips appear fuller, and her straight, dark brown hair, almost black, didn't stand out much on its own. But there were other features that more than made up for it. Her bright blue eyes, smooth creamy complexion, and a pair of cute dimples made her look far younger than her age. Though she was 5 years older than her sister Cindy, people often mistook her for the younger sibling. As she thought about it more, Samantha was certain the lack of passion in her marriage over the last few years had nothing to do with her appearance. Screw David, she thought bitterly. In the end, he got what he deserved. Tomorrow would mark a full week since he left for his trip, and he still hadn't bothered to call her. That was the clearest sign yet of how little she meant to him. Once again, she resolved not to cry over a man who had stopped showing her love a long time ago. Tonight, when she returned home, she would try to hold on to that strength. From her closet, she chose a scarlet tank top that accentuated her modest cleavage. She didn't feel like wearing a skirt tonight, so she rifled through her trousers and found exactly what she needed, a pair of black leather pants she hadn't worn in years. The last time she remembered wearing them was at a Halloween party 3 or 4 years ago, and even at a glance, she knew they would still fit. She recalled how they had hugged her hips and but just right, maybe even enough to make David notice her again. Laying the tank top and pants on the bed, she took her time rubbing scented body lotion into her skin. The red lace bra and panties she slipped into were bold and revealing, reminding her of the passion she so desperately needed in her life. John had reawakened something inside her, something she hadn't realized she missed until their affair began. Maybe it was because she was nearing 40, that fabled sexual peak she'd heard so much about. When she put on the leather pants, she was glad to see they still fit snugly, and the bright red tank top complemented them perfectly. The outfit was sexy but not overly provocative, just eye-catching enough. In the bathroom, she added the finishing touches, a light sprinkle of perfume, a bit of blush for her pale cheeks, and some eyeliner to highlight her blue eyes. The only part of her face she felt insecure about were her lips, but after applying red lipstick, she smiled to herself and playfully kissed the mirror, leaving a perfect lipstick print behind. After blow-drying her hair, she used a curling iron to add some volume to the ends of her otherwise straight locks. Satisfied with the look, she grabbed her purse and keys, slipped into a pair of cute black shoes, and buttoned up her coat before heading out. The hotel where John was staying wasn't far, but even the short drive gave her too much time to think. The first 2 times she cheated, John had come to her. Tonight, she was going to him, with one clear thought in her head. Deep down, Samantha knew her marriage had been over before the first infidelity, but that didn't make it any easier. Still, if her marriage was dead, why shouldn't she allow herself the pleasure of being with someone who made her feel alive again? The Sunday afternoon traffic was light, and she parked easily in the hotel's visitor lot. As she approached his door, she knocked softly. A moment later, she heard John's voice from inside. "Just a second," he said, opening the door while holding his cell phone to his ear. His eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Oh, it's just room service," he said into the phone, placing a finger over his lips as he motioned for her to come in. "Listen, I'll call you back tomorrow, okay?" "Yeah, tomorrow. Bye." He hung up and smiled at her, a mix of relief and nervousness in his eyes. "Your wife?" Samantha asked, noticing how effortlessly attractive he looked, even in a simple blue t-shirt and jeans. "Yeah," he replied, walking past her to close his laptop, quickly shuffling papers into his briefcase. "I knew you'd come, but I didn't think it would be this soon. Have a seat." He pointed to the chair, but Samantha wandered over to the unmade bed and sat down instead. "Do you love her?" she asked, reclining on the bed, her tone casual but loaded with meaning. Who? John asked, still flustered by her unexpected arrival. Your wife, Samantha repeated, more directly this time. Do you still love her? He paused, then shot back, do you still love your husband? His defensive tone made the air between them tense. I asked first, she pressed. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he admitted. There's a lot I love about her. I can't imagine leaving her or the kids, but with you, I feel something I haven't felt in years. A spark. He shrugged, still searching for the right words. What we did. I feel guilty about it, but at the same time, I can't stop. Do you cheat on her every time you leave home? She asked bluntly. Does it matter? He countered. For me. No, Samantha said honestly. There were others, but none of them were like you. Of course not, he said, giving her a knowing grin. So, what about you? He asked. Have you cheated before? You were the first, she said, turning her shame into a half-joke. Before you, I was innocent in the matter of adultery. And your husband? John asked, his hand grazing her leg, inching higher. Part of me still loves him, she admitted, but the words felt hollow. But I know he doesn't love me anymore. That's what makes what we do possible, and easier, every time. Samantha took his hand, pulling him toward her. The conversation had been pleasant, but she knew why she was really here. As John kissed her, all other thoughts faded. They made love again, and later, when she returned from the bathroom, she found him sitting at his computer, hurriedly closing whatever he had been working on earlier. Whatever it was, she could tell it wasn't meant for her eyes, but right now, it didn't matter. He was still naked, and that's all she cared about. Does your husband sleep with you anymore? John asked, breaking the silence. Samantha hesitated. Yes, he's asleep, she answered protectively, then wondered why she still felt the need to defend him. I just never get as much as I need, she admitted, feeling a pang of frustration. And what about you? She asked, shifting the focus. Do you and your wife still have sex? John looked thoughtful for a moment, as if he had to remember. If I got what I needed from her, I wouldn't be here, he replied with a hint of bitterness. She's stupid, Samantha said, trying to lighten the mood. She and David sound like they'd be perfect for each other. John grinned. Maybe so, he said, but his smile faded as he saw the sadness in her eyes. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, he added, touching her hand. It must be hard for you. The first time. I was so ashamed, Samantha confessed, her voice soft. But that didn't stop me from doing it again and again. Let's talk about something else, she said, shivering as a chill suddenly swept through her. You look cold, John said, standing up and heading to the bathroom. He returned with a robe and handed it to her. Here, put this on. Thank you, she said, slipping it over her bare skin. How about I order us dinner? On my company's tab, he suggested, picking up the menu. What are you in the mood for? Samantha agreed, and John called in a room service order. As he dressed, she sat there, feeling strange. The sex with him was good, but she didn't really know him. And no matter how well they connected physically, they had little to talk about. Samantha wasn't looking for a new man, not long-term at least. She knew things were over between her and David, but she wasn't ready for anything more serious with John either. The conversation felt awkward, and the silence between them made her uncomfortable. When the food arrived, Samantha hurried into the bathroom to hide. The room service attendant wouldn't know who she was, but she didn't want to be seen as some woman sneaking around behind her husband's back, even though that was exactly what she was doing. All clear, John called after the attendant left. She rejoined him, sitting down at the table, but even as they ate in silence, she felt vulnerable. Sitting there in her robe, still somewhat exposed, made her feel insecure. She couldn't wait for them to get back to bed, where at least she could hide behind their physical connection. John's gaze drifted over her legs, lingering at her chest, and for the first time that night, it relaxed her a little. He clearly still wanted her, and that was enough for now. After dinner, John went to the bathroom, and Samantha looked around the room, unsure of what to do. She considered turning on the TV but decided against it. Her mind was too preoccupied. With her busy schedule the following week, she could use an early start as an excuse to leave if things got too uncomfortable. When John emerged from the bathroom, undressed again, she smiled. Standing up, she slipped off her robe and stepped into his arms. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, John," she said, giving him a sweet smile. "It was my pleasure," he replied with sincerity. "When can I see you again?" she asked, standing at the edge of the bed. "I'll be here all week," he replied. "Just a week?" she asked quickly, though she already knew she was lucky his trip had lasted this long. "Just a week," he confirmed. "Then we'll have to make the most of it," she said, leaning in to kiss him again. As she turned to leave later that night, Samantha smiled to herself. For the first time in a long time, she slept easily. Her thoughts were elsewhere, and David became less important with each passing day. A week ago, if someone had asked her, she would have said she loved him more than anything in the world. But now, everything had changed. If given the choice, she would trade him for John in a heartbeat. She still held on to the hope that her marriage could somehow survive, but she knew better. She was too realistic to believe it had any real chance. The next day dragged on, even by Monday standards. All day, Samantha found herself thinking about meeting John again that evening. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. She almost wished she could cancel her appointments to see him sooner, but John was likely busy during the day as well. The thought of losing him after just a week stung, but she couldn't deny that his presence had helped her face the reality of her doomed marriage. She was grateful to him, and she intended to show him just how much the rest of the week. In her rush to see him again, Samantha arrived at the train station early, but the train was late. The delay frustrated her, as the time without him seemed to stretch endlessly. Samantha was on the verge of calling a taxi for the expensive ride home when the train finally arrived. The delay only deepened her frustration, her mind racing with the possibility that John might leave, thinking she wasn't coming tonight. She decided to get off at the stop near his hotel instead of heading home. As she stood up while the train slowed, she felt the judgmental glances from the regular passengers. "Who are they to judge me?" she thought bitterly. "They can all go to hell." She stepped off the train, not looking back. "Just a second." John called from inside when she knocked on his door a little later. As he opened it, he immediately noticed the anger and frustration etched on her face. "Tough day?" he asked, sensing her emotions. "Oh, John," she sobbed, collapsing into his warm embrace. Clinging to his torso, she let the tension melt away. "Shoo, it's okay, Carly," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. "I know how hard it can be," he said, misreading her emotions entirely. That night, they lost themselves in each other once again. Every night that week, Carly went straight to his hotel after her last meeting, avoiding the train and its judgmental passengers by taking her car. Though she eagerly anticipated her time with John, the looming weekend filled her with dread. He was leaving Saturday morning, having already pushed back his flight from Friday night to spend one last evening together. Friday night came too quickly, and as she drove to his hotel for the final time, her mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. She owed John so much, he had filled the void in her heart where love for her husband had once bloomed. Nearly 2 weeks had passed, and David still hadn't called her. If this trip had taught her anything, it was that living without her husband wasn't as difficult as she'd once feared. Sitting in her parked car, she took a few minutes to collect her thoughts before getting out. Her stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and sadness as she rode the elevator up to John's room. Taking a deep breath, she smiled as she knocked on his door. John opened it almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for her. You look beautiful, he said, his eyes trailing down her body, his hand brushing her arm. You don't need to say that, she replied, feeling embarrassed as she turned away from the intensity of his gaze. She hadn't even gone home to freshen up after work, she looked the same as she did every weekday. It's true, Carly, he insisted, leaning in to kiss her. She sighed at the warmth of his lips. Your husband is a fool, John murmured. He doesn't know how lucky he is. Let's not talk about him, she said softly, biting her lower lip as she looked away. Sorry, I didn't mean to, John began to apologize, but she cut him off with a smile. It's okay, she said, pulling him closer. I'd rather enjoy my time with someone who values it than worry about what tomorrow will bring. Wrapping her arms around his neck, she pulled him into another kiss. As they kissed, she couldn't help but wonder if she was deceiving herself. David had been so distant and cold since his business began to fail, that even the smallest gesture of interest from another man seemed irresistible in comparison. Sex with John was thrilling, as it often is with someone new, but would it last? She craved more than just passion, she wanted a new life, a second chance at the marriage she had always dreamed of. A husband who cared for her, children in a home filled with love. There was still a chance for that, but it couldn't be with a man who didn't love her. Do you want to go to dinner? John asked suddenly, breaking into her thoughts. No, she replied quickly, still lost in her racing mind. I just want to stay here tonight. Then how about I order us something nice, not just room service, he suggested, smiling warmly. I'd like that, she said, smiling back. What do you feel like eating? Do you know this city well? He asked, flipping through the menu. How about sushi? She suggested. I know a great place, but it's pretty expensive. Order whatever you like, John replied, watching her with a grin. As Samantha placed their dinner order, she glanced over at John. Their eyes met, and for a moment, she felt that familiar tug of insecurity. At first, she had been embarrassed to be naked in front of a new man after all these years, but after a week of passionate nights, her confidence had returned. Knowing John found her attractive was a huge relief after enduring years of indifference from David. Just as they were getting comfortable again, there was a knock on the door. John, she whispered, panicked as she scrambled to cover herself with the blanket. Relax, it's just the food, he said, laughing softly as he pulled on a pair of pants. Samantha quickly buried her face in the pillow, curling up as if that could somehow make her invisible. She felt her heart race as the delivery guy entered the room. Though she knew it was irrational, she could feel his eyes scanning the room, possibly catching a glimpse of her bare skin beneath the covers. Just put it on the table, John said casually, handing the man a tip. Right, thanks, the delivery guy muttered, clearly uncomfortable. Samantha cringed, imagining the delivery man's lingering gaze as John collected the food. The door closed, and finally, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Well, John said, smiling as he came back to the bed, that was close. I gave that guy the best tip of his night, John said, laughing next to her. Samantha pulled the pillow from her head, shaking her head with disbelief. I can't believe you did that, she said, though her anger had already faded, replaced by the adrenaline of the situation. Relax, Carly. He only got a glimpse of a beautiful, anonymous body. Who could blame him for looking? John teased. The poor guy probably hoped I'd invite him to join. Forget you, John, she said with a grin, gathering her discarded clothes. It was just a joke, he protested. Maybe if I hurry, I can catch up with him, she said, turning toward the bathroom with her clothes in hand. But before she could move, John grabbed her hand and pulled her back, pressing her against the bathroom door. He kissed her passionately, and though she initially resisted, she quickly gave in, the pull too strong to fight. Sorry, he whispered, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and desire, apologizing for the kiss and perhaps much more. If you still want to go. But Samantha dropped her clothes, jumping into his arms instead. Later, they sat together in bed, naked, eating dinner. Chopsticks had been provided, but John was terribly clumsy with them, spilling sauce on his chest after several failed attempts. She watched him struggle before he finally gave her a helpless look. "I'm a mess," he said, with a hint of sadness in his voice. John then mentioned his early flight, and Samantha took the hint. After finishing her shower, she walked past her clothes, lying down on the bed and patting the empty space next to her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I want to stay here tonight," she said quietly. "If that's not okay, I'll leave, but I'm not ready to let go yet." "Of course you can stay," he said, slipping into bed beside her. The next morning, Samantha woke to John kissing her gently. She reached out to hug him, but her fingers brushed the fabric of his shirt, and panic washed over her as she realized what was happening. "No, John, you can't leave now," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "My plane leaves in an hour," he said gently. "It's a shame we don't have more time, Carly, but this is the end." "When can I see you again?" she asked desperately. John hesitated, clearly confused. "See me again? I need to see you again, John. What we have, it's special," she said, unable to hold back the flood of emotions she had been trying to avoid. "Forget about your wife, forget about my husband. We have each other. Carly." He began, searching for the right words. "It was fun, but oh God, I'm so stupid," she cut him off, her voice breaking. "What have I done? My husband. I can't believe I did this to him. To us. I need to tell him, I need to explain how sorry I am." "No." John grabbed her by the shoulders, his voice firm. "Are you crazy? Listen to me, Carly. Just because we don't have a future doesn't mean you have to stay with him, but don't tell him anything. There are plenty of men out there who would dream of being with a woman like you. Sorry it can't be me, but you'll find someone who fits." Samantha sat there, lifeless, as John kissed her lips one last time. She didn't respond. Then he left. Outside, John took a deep breath. He had done a lot of terrible things in his life, but the last 2 weeks weighed heavily on him. As he rode the elevator down to the lobby, he paid the bill, mentioning that a woman would leave the room within the hour. He stepped into a waiting taxi and turned on his laptop, instructing the driver to take him to the airport. As soon as the computer booted up, his cell phone rang. He didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. "Hello?" John answered. "Yes, I'm on my way to the airport now." "No, I didn't find anything." "Sorry, David. As far as I can tell, your wife spends her time running in the mornings and working late at the office." John stared at the screen, watching a video recorded by the hidden camera in his hotel room. His report was mostly true, until he turned on his charm and seduced her himself. David had hired him months ago, looking for a way to break free of his prenuptial agreement. He had a mistress and wanted to leave Carly, but couldn't afford to give her half of the business, which was already in financial trouble. That's why he hired John, to dig up dirt on Carly, hoping to escape his marriage unscathed. But when no dirt could be found, John knew what he had to do. Carly wasn't the first married woman he had seduced to ruin a marriage, but she was the first he regretted afterward. "She visited that Charlie guy you mentioned and spent time with her sister over the weekend," John continued, "but otherwise, it was just her visiting law offices." "I know that's not what you wanted to hear," John said, closing the video and deleting it from his hard drive. "But that's the truth. I don't know if you can keep living this lie, David, but the results are what they are. Anyway, you know the cost." David was silent on the other end of the line. "You know what, David?" John added after a beat. "Use another agency the next time you need a rat in your accounting department." With that, John ended the call, turning his attention back to the city lights as the taxi sped toward the airport, leaving everything behind. Here's the reworked version of this part of your story. Underscore 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 underscore. I hope you get what you deserve, John muttered to himself as he hung up the phone, then turned it off. Sitting in the back of the taxi, he scrolled through the photos on his phone, one by one, deleting each one as he went. He didn't need them anymore. Poor Carly deserved so much better than her scumbag husband. John wanted to stay, but she deserved better than him too. With a sigh, he slipped off his wedding ring, carefully tucking it into his jacket, along with the fake ID he'd used for the job. The airport was already in sight, ready to send him back to his empty life. As the city lights blurred past, John found himself hoping that Carly would follow his advice and start fresh, far away from her toxic marriage. Meanwhile, back in her house, as soon as the door closed behind him, a satisfied smile spread across Carly's lips. Where are all those people now who said drama classes were a waste of time in college? She thought to herself. She had played her part perfectly. She almost told John she loved him, but that would have been too much. It was all an act, a way to keep him from telling David what had really happened. But in the end, it didn't matter. Charlie had assured her it was nearly impossible for David to break their prenuptial agreement, and several top lawyers had agreed. Still, it would be a pleasure to see the look on David's face when she filed for divorce and told him she knew everything. Carly sat down and laughed quietly to herself as she thought about how blind she had been. The first night she met John, or Magnum, as she had called him then, she had a feeling she'd seen him before. She had quickly realized that John wasn't his real name, just like Magnum wasn't his real identity either. At first, she couldn't understand why he had been watching her, but once she started examining her broken marriage from a new angle, the pieces fell into place. David's clumsy attempts to hide his infidelity now seemed so obvious. Carly felt foolish for not noticing sooner. The idiot had even paid for hotels and dinners with his mistress using the same credit card they shared. He was so obsessed with racking up bonus miles that he never thought twice about the paper trail he was leaving behind. She laughed out loud, remembering how David wouldn't buy a loaf of bread without using that card. All the evidence was right there, hidden in plain sight. Business trip to Florida, but a charge at a hotel in their own state. A conference in Chicago, but a romantic dinner for two at an upscale restaurant downtown. A visit to his sick uncle in Montana, but flowers from a local florist. Flowers. When was the last time David had given her flowers? Some of his trips may have been real, but Carly had already matched enough suspicious purchases to the dates in her diary to realize he had been cheating for at least 2 years. She'd only gone through 2 years of statements, but that was enough. Knowing when the affair started wasn't even the worst part. What hurt more was realizing that David had hired someone to spy on her. She could have possibly forgiven the cheating, but the fact that he thought she would stoop to his level made her sick. The first week after discovering everything, Carly didn't know what to do. Thankfully, the support from friends like Charlie and Barb, along with her sister and family, helped calm her. She had told them all about David's affair, and they were ready to stand by her, no matter what decision she made. In the end, Carly decided the best revenge would be to sleep with the man David had hired to spy on her. That John, Magnum, turned out to be an attractive and skilled lover was just an added bonus. She smiled, thinking about how that would be another surprise she'd spring on David when the time was right. At first, she almost felt sorry for David. Carly had never loved anyone the way she had loved him. The thought that she might never feel that way again was sobering. Initially, she had only planned to demand the house and let David keep the rest. But after 2 weeks of rage, her heart had hardened. She was going to take everything she was entitled to in the marriage contract, including his half share in the company. David had started with 3 partners, all of whom had insisted on prenuptial agreements to protect their business interests. Over time, David had bought out their shares, but the prenuptial agreement remained unchanged. Carly was entitled to half of his portion, and she intended to claim every last cent, minus his share of the house's value. She doubted his business would survive this blow, but that wasn't her problem. David had no one to blame but himself. If he had spent half as much effort on his marriage as he did on his affair, none of this would have happened. Sitting in her office, Carly stared at the computer screen, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. A notification popped up, a fax had come in. She had already prepared the papers to file for divorce and was waiting for Charlie and the other lawyers to confirm that everything was in order. Today was the day she was supposed to start her new life. She wasn't sure how David would react. He had grown so cold and distant in recent years, but their history still had a grip on her heart. The thought of breaking away from all they had shared, their long years of marriage, their dreams of a family, and the home they had built together, was both liberating and terrifying. Charlie had assured her that she was entitled to half of everything, including the business. David would be forced to sell a significant portion of his assets to pay her off, and his company likely wouldn't survive. Carly took a deep breath. She was ready for this. It was time to let go of the past and begin again. Carly knew this would hit David hard, but her heart had no room left for pity. Not for a man who had been so indifferent to their marriage. She took a deep breath, sipping her iced coffee as thousands of thoughts raced through her mind. She remembered when David had once been everything to her, when they dreamed of the future, of children, and how he had supported her through law school. They had laughed, cried, and built a life together. But all of that was in the past. Now, a new life awaited her, a new opportunity for happiness. After finishing the paperwork for the divorce, Carly filled out the final forms and sent them to be printed. Tomorrow, she would take them to court, marking the beginning of the end of her marriage and the start of a new chapter in her life. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to fight for her future. That evening, Carly met with Charlie and Barb, her pillars of support throughout this ordeal. Dinner at their house was warm and filled with laughter, providing much-needed distraction from her difficult thoughts. She knew she could count on them no matter what. "You're a strong woman, Carly," Charlie said as they sat on the porch after dinner. "You'll get through this and come out stronger." "Thank you," she replied with a smile. "I don't know what I would have done without you and Barb. I feel like I'm finally finding my strength and independence." "We're always here for you," Barb said, pulling Carly into a hug. "Don't ever forget that." When Carly returned home that night, she felt a lightness in her heart. Tomorrow, a new life would begin, and she was ready for it. Walking through the door, she paused for a moment, realizing that this house no longer felt like a prison. Instead, it would be the place where she could begin again. The next morning, Carly woke early, the sun's rays spilling through the curtains. She got up, showered, and dressed in a sharp business suit. After gathering her documents and bag, she left the house, ready to take on the day. Everything in court moved quickly. She submitted the paperwork, and the clerk assured her it would be reviewed soon. Walking out of the courthouse, Carly felt a wave of relief wash over her. Now, it was all in the hands of the judge and her lawyers. Days passed as she waited for news, immersing herself in work to avoid thinking about what lay ahead. She met with Charlie often, seeking his advice and comfort, and spent her evenings with her sister Cindy and her family, finding solace in their company. One evening, while driving home from dinner at Cindy's, Carly received a text from her lawyer. The court had scheduled a hearing for the following month, sooner than she had expected. A spark of hope flared in her heart. She knew the process wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to fight for her future. When the day of the hearing arrived, Carly felt confident. She walked into the courtroom with her head held high. Her lawyer was by her side, and she knew she had done everything she could to prepare. David was there too, but she didn't glance in his direction. Their paths had diverged, and her focus was only on the future. The trial was tense, with both lawyers presenting evidence and arguments. Carly spoke confidently about her life with David, explaining how their marriage had unraveled and how she had taken control of her own future. She was calm and firm, her voice steady as she recounted the events that had led her here. Across the room, David sat silently, looking tired and defeated. She could see he was suffering too, but it didn't change her resolve. The decision to end their marriage was inevitable. As the judge delivered the verdict, Carly felt the tension drain from her body. The judge granted her demands, and at that moment, she was free. Stepping out of the courthouse, the sun shone warmly on her face. It was a new day, a new beginning. Several months passed. Carly moved into a new apartment, started exciting new projects at work, and found joy in new hobbies. Her life filled up with fresh faces, meetings, and events. She even began running again, finding peace and freedom in the early morning air. One morning, after finishing her run, Carly received a text from Charlie. He invited her to dinner, a celebration of her new life. She gladly accepted, and later that evening, she arrived at Charlie and Barb's house, greeted with warm smiles and hugs. "We're so proud of you, Carly," Charlie said, raising his glass. "You've been through a lot, and you've come out stronger on the other side." "Thank you, Charlie," she replied, raising her own glass. "It wasn't easy, but I'm grateful I had you by my side. Here's to new beginnings." Barb added, toasting to the future. The evening passed in a comfortable, joyful atmosphere. They laughed, reminisced about old times, and made plans for the future. Carly felt as though her life was finally finding its direction and meaning. She was grateful for the unwavering support of her friends and family, who had helped her navigate through the storm. When Carly returned home that night, her heart was full of hope. She knew that new challenges and opportunities lay ahead, but she was ready for them. She had found her strength and confidence, and now nothing could stop her. Several years passed, and Carly continued to thrive, both in her career and in her personal life. Each step she took reinforced the belief that she was building a life on her terms, stronger, wiser, and more fulfilled than ever before. Carly's life had blossomed in ways she hadn't thought possible. She discovered new hobbies, made new friends, and filled her days with rich experiences. The shadows of her past no longer weighed her down, she was free. One day, while taking a peaceful walk in the park, she met a man named Michael. He was kind, caring, and understanding, qualities she had been searching for. As they got to know each other, their relationship deepened, and Carly found herself falling in love again. This time, she was ready to nurture and grow that love. Michael became her rock, the support she needed as she moved forward from her past. He understood the struggles she had been through and accepted her for who she was, flaws and all. Together, they made plans for a future full of love and warmth, dreaming of a home where happiness thrived. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Carly's thoughts drifted back to her past. She thought about David, about how their lives had split apart and how she had found her inner strength. She realized her past was just that, a memory, a lesson. Her present and future were with Michael, and she was ready for this new chapter in her life. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, pulling her close and hugging her. "About how happy I am," she replied, smiling at him. "Thank you for being in my life." "I'm happy too," he said, kissing her forehead. "We'll get through everything together, no matter what." Carly knew then that her life was full of love and joy. She had found her strength, her happiness, and she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. With Michael by her side, she knew they could face anything. Over time, their bond grew even stronger. Carly and Michael built a home filled with laughter and warmth. They traveled, made new friends, and embraced every moment together. Carly's career flourished, and she took pride in her accomplishments, but her heart was most content with the life they were building together. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Michael turned to her with a smile and a question that took her breath away. He proposed. Carly was stunned, but joy flooded her heart. She had found her soulmate, and without hesitation, she said yes. Tears of happiness streamed down her cheeks as they embraced. Their wedding was simple but beautiful. Surrounded by close family and friends, the day was filled with love and laughter. Carly felt like the luckiest woman in the world, her heart brimming with gratitude for the new chapter in her life. Not long after, Carly and Michael became parents. They welcomed a son, Jack, into their lives. Their home was now filled with even more joy and laughter. Carly cherished every moment with her family, knowing that she had found the life she had always dreamed of. Though she continued working, her priority was now her family. She spent more time at home, caring for Jack and supporting Michael. Their lives were filled with adventure and happiness, with each day bringing new surprises. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Carly watched Michael and Jack play together. Her heart swelled with gratitude for the journey that had led her to this moment. "Mom, what are you thinking about?" Jack asked, looking up at her with wide, curious eyes. "I'm thinking about how happy I am to have you and Dad," she answered, smiling down at him. "I love you both more than anything in the world." "We love you too," Michael said, wrapping his arms around them both. "You're our treasure, Carly." In that moment, Carly knew her life was complete. She had found her happiness, her strength, and her family. Her future was bright, and she was ready for whatever new adventures awaited her. Life went on, and Carly embraced every second of it, knowing that many more beautiful moments were yet to come. Years passed, and Carly's life continued to flourish. Her family was her greatest joy, and her career thrived. But life, as she knew, was unpredictable, and one evening, as they sat by the fireplace, an unexpected letter arrived in the mail. It was from a lawyer representing David. Carly hadn't heard from him in years, and she felt a chill run down her spine as she opened the envelope. Inside was a legal notice, a summons to court. David, it seemed, was contesting their divorce settlement, claiming that he had been deceived and was now seeking to reclaim his share of the business and the house. Carly felt her old wounds stir. After everything that had happened, David was coming back to disrupt her life once again. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, noticing the tension in her face. Carly took a deep breath. "David's trying to take everything back. He's dragging me back to court." Michael looked at her with concern but also with confidence. "We'll face this together. He can't take what's yours, what we built." Determined not to let David tear apart her new life, Carly gathered her strength. She hired the best lawyer she could find, ready to fight for everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. The court case dragged on for months, the tension mounting as they prepared for the final hearing. On the day of the trial, Carly entered the courtroom with Michael by her side, her heart racing. David, looking haggard and bitter, sat across the room. His lawyer argued that Carly had manipulated the original settlement, that she had hidden assets, and that he was entitled to more than he had agreed to in the divorce. But Carly's team was ready. They had gathered evidence, including documents showing how David had tried to hide his own financial wrongdoings during their marriage. In a dramatic twist, Carly's lawyer presented evidence from David's own former business partners, revealing that David had been siphoning money into hidden accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle with his mistress. This bombshell revelation shocked the courtroom, and David's smug expression turned into disbelief. As the final verdict was read, Carly felt a rush of relief. The judge ruled in her favor, David's claims were dismissed, and Carly's share of the business, along with her home, remained untouched. Not only that, but David was ordered to pay damages for his deceit, leaving him in financial ruin. Outside the courtroom, Carly felt an overwhelming sense of victory and closure. Michael hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did it. It's finally over." With a smile, Carly replied, "We did it. Together." Later that evening, Carly, Michael, and Jack returned home to celebrate their triumph. As they sat by the fireplace, Carly realized that this moment wasn't just the end of the battle with David, it was the beginning of a new, even brighter chapter. She had overcome every obstacle thrown her way and emerged stronger than ever. Looking into Michael's eyes, she knew she had finally left her past behind for good. Life was unpredictable, yes, but now Carly understood her true power. She could face anything, and with her family by her side, she would always win. As the fire crackled in the background, Michael leaned in and whispered, "Let's make this a night to remember." And with that, Carly smiled, knowing the greatest adventure of her life was still unfolding. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel to watch my next videos and share with me your opinion, what you would do in my place.